Good morning. I'm going to be reading chapters 12, 13, and 14 today, and I'm outside so you might hear the birds. When George opened his eyes again, he saw a massive pale yellow planet with a belt of rings rising in the dark sky ahead of them. They sped along on the comet, heading for a point just above the rings. From far away, the rings looked like soft ribbons. Some were pale yellow like the planet itself, others were darker. "This is Saturn," said Annie, "and I saw it first." "I know what it is," replied George. "And what do you mean, first? I'm in front of you. I saw it first." No, you weren't looking. You were too scared. You had your eyes shut." Annie's voice rang inside his helmet. "No, I didn't," protested George. "Shh," Annie interrupted him. "Did you know that Saturn is the second biggest of the planets that move around the sun?" "Of course I knew," lied George. "Oh, really?" replied Annie. "Then if you knew that, you'll know which one is the biggest planet of all." "Well, said George, who had no idea. "Is it the Earth, isn't it?" "Wrong," trumpeted Annie. "The Earth is teeny weeny. Just like your silly little brain. The Earth is only number 5. "How do you know that?" "How do I know you've got a silly little brain?" said Annie sarcastically. "Oh, stupid," said George furiously. "How do you know about the planets?" "Because I've done this trip many, many times before," said Annie, tossing her head as though throwing back her ponytail. "So let me tell you, and listen carefully," she ordered. "There are 8 planets orbiting the sun. 4 are huge and 4 are small. The huge ones are Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, and Uranus, but the 2 biggest are so much bigger than the others that they are called the giants. Saturn is the second of the giant planets, and the biggest one of all is Jupiter. The 4 small planets are Mars, Earth, Venus, and Mercury," she continued, ticking them off on her fingers. "The Earth is the biggest of the small ones, but if you put these 4 together into a ball, you still won't get anything nearly as big as Saturn. Saturn is more than 45 times bigger than these 4 small planets added together." Annie was clearly delighted to be showing off about the planets. Even though he was very annoyed by how smug she was, George was secretly impressed. All he had ever done was dig potatoes and mess around with a pig in his backyard. It wasn't much in comparison with riding around the solar system on a comet. As Annie talked, the comet flew nearer and nearer to Saturn. They got so close that George could see that the rings were made not of ribbons, but of ice, rock, and stones. These were all different sizes, the smallest no bigger than a speck of dust, the largest about 12 feet long. Most of them were moving much too fast for George to catch one, but then he spotted a small chunk of rock calmly floating right next to him. A quick glance behind showed that Annie wasn't looking. He reached out, snatched the rock, and held it up in his space glove, a real treasure from outer space. His heart was beating fast. The sound was so loud in his ears that he thought Annie must be able to hear it through the sound transmitter in his helmet. He suspected that taking things home from outer space was probably not allowed, so he hoped she hadn't noticed. "George, are you all right?" asked Annie. "Why are you wriggling around like that?" George quickly thought of something to say to divert her attention from the rock he was trying to stuff into his pocket. "Why did we change direction? Did our comet move toward Saturn? Why didn't we continue in a straight line?" he babbled. "Oh dear, you just don't know anything at all, do you?" sighed Annie. It's lucky for you that I'm such a fount of useful scientific knowledge," she added importantly. "We moved toward the sun because we fell toward it, just like an apple falls on Earth. Just like we fell onto the comet when we arrived, just like the particles in space clouds fall into each other and become balls that become stars. Everything falls towards everything throughout the universe. And do you know the name of what causes this fall?" George didn't have a clue. "It's called gravity. So it's because of gravity that we're going to fall on Saturn now and crash?" "No, silly. We're moving way too fast to crash. We're just flying by it to say hello." Annie waved to Saturn and shouted, "Hello, Saturn!" so loudly that George's hands automatically tried to cover his ears, but he couldn't because of the helmet. So instead he yelled back, "Don't shout!" "Oh, I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to." As they whizzed past Saturn, George saw that Annie was right. The comet didn't fall all the way onto the giant planet, but cruised straight past instead. With some distance now, he could see that Saturn not only had rings, but also a moon, like the Earth. Looking closer, he could hardly believe his eyes. He saw another moon, and another, and yet another. In total, he saw 5 large moons and even more small ones before Saturn was too far away to keep him counting. Saturn has at least 5 moons, he thought. George hadn't known that a planet other than Earth could have even 1 moon, let alone 5. He looked at Saturn with respect as the giant planet with rings shrank into the distance behind them until it was just a bright dot in the starry background. Chapter 13. The comet, now traveling straight again in front of them, the sun was bigger and brighter than before, but still very small compared to its size when seen from Earth. George spotted another bright dot that he hadn't noticed before, a dot that was quickly growing bigger as they approached it. "What's over there?" he asked, pointing ahead to the right. "Is that another planet?" But there was no reply. When he looked around, Annie had gone. George untied himself from the comet and followed the trail of footprints she had left in the icy powder. He carefully gauged the length of his footsteps so that he wouldn't find himself flying off the comet again. After climbing carefully over a small icy hill, he saw her. She was peering into a hole in the ground. Around the hole were bits and pieces of rock that seemed to have been spat out by the comet itself. George walked over and looked down into the hole. It was a few feet deep with nothing much to be seen at the bottom. "What is that?" he asked. "Have you found something?" "Well, you see, I went for a walk," Annie started to explain. "Why didn't you tell me?" George interrupted her. "You were shouting at me about not shouting," said Annie, "so I thought I'd just go by myself, because then there'd be no one to get mad at me," she added pointedly. "I'm not mad at you," said George. "Yes, you are. You're always angry with me. It doesn't make any difference if I'm nice to you or not." "I'm not angry," shouted George. "Yes, you are," shouted back Annie, balling her gloved hands into fists and shaking them at George. As she did so, something extraordinary happened. A little fountain of gas and dirt blew up from the ground just next to her. "Now look what you've done," complained George. But as he spoke, another little fountain erupted through the rock right next to him. It formed a cloud of dust that slowly dispersed. "Annie, what's happening?" he asked. It's nothing," replied Annie. "It's all fine." "Don't worry," but she didn't sound very sure. "Why don't we go and sit down where we were before?" she suggested. "It's nicer over there." But as they walked back, more and more little geysers of dust erupted around them, leaving a haze of smoke in the air. Neither of them felt very safe, but neither of them wanted to admit it. Then they just walked more and more quickly toward the place where they'd been sitting before. Without saying a word, they anchored themselves into the comet once more. In the sky, the bright dot George had seen growing had become much bigger. It now looked like a planet with red and blue stripes. "That's Jupiter," Annie said, breaking the silence. But she was whispering now. She didn't sound like the confident show-off she had been earlier. "It's the biggest of the planets, about twice the volume of Saturn. That makes it more than 1,000 times the volume of Earth." "Does Jupiter have moons too?" George asked. "Yes, it does," replied Annie, "but I don't know how many. I didn't count them last time I was here, so I'm not sure." "Have you really been here before?" George looked suspicious. "Of course I have," said Annie indignantly. George wasn't sure he believed her. Once again, the comet and Annie and George started to fall. As they fell, George gazed at Jupiter. Even by Saturn's standards, Jupiter was enormous. As they flew by, Annie pointed out a big red mark on Jupiter's surface. "That thing," she said, "is a huge storm. It's been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years, maybe even more. I don't know. It's over twice the size of Earth." As they moved away from Jupiter, George counted how many moons he could spot. 4 big ones. 4 big ones what? "Moons. Jupiter has 4 big moons and lots of little ones. I think it has even more moons than Saturn." "Oh, okay," said Annie, who was sounding nervous now. "If you say so." George was worried. It wasn't like Annie to agree with anything he said. He noticed she had shuffled a little closer to him. She slipped her hand on its space glove onto his. All around them, new jets of gas and dust were springing up out of the rock, each one spitting out a small cloud. A thin haze was forming over the whole comet. "Are you all right?" he asked Annie. She had stopped showing off and being rude, and he felt sure something was very wrong. "George, Annie started to reply when a huge rock smashed into the comet behind them, shaking the ground like an earthquake and sending up even more dust and ice into the haze. Looking up, George and Annie saw there were hundreds and hundreds of rocks all coming toward them at a high speed, and there was nowhere to hide. "Asteroids!" cried Annie. "We're in an asteroid storm!" Chapter 14. "What do we do?" yelled George. "Nothing," shrieked Annie. "There's nothing we can do. Try not to get squashed. I'll call Cosmos to get us back." The comet shot through the asteroid with incredible speed. Another large rock hit the comet just in front of them, raining down smaller rocks on their spacesuits and helmets. Through the voice transmitter in his helmet, George heard Annie scream, but suddenly the scream went silent. The noise just stopped like a radio being switched off. George tried to say something to Annie through the voice transmitter, but she didn't seem to hear him. He turned to look at her. He could see she was trying to speak to him from inside the glass space helmet, but he couldn't hear anything she said. He shouted as loudly as he could, "Annie, get us home! Get us home!" But it was no use. He could see now that the tiny antenna on her helmet was snapped in half. That must be why he couldn't talk to her. Did this mean she couldn't talk to the Cosmos either? Annie was nodding like crazy and holding on to George very tightly. She was trying as hard as she could to summon Cosmos to come and get them both, but the computer wasn't answering. As George feared, the device that linked her both to him and to Cosmos had been broken by the rocks raining down on them. They were stuck on the comet, flying through an asteroid storm, and it seemed there was no way out. George tried to call Cosmos himself, but he didn't know how to do it or whether he even had the right equipment. He got no reply. Annie and George hung on to each other and squeezed their eyes shut. But just as suddenly as the storm had started, it stopped again. 1 minute, rocks were thudding down on the comet all around them. The next, the comet had flown out of the other side of the storm. Looking around, George and Annie realized how very lucky they had been to escape. The rocks were forming a huge line that seemed to extend all the way through space. They were mainly large and scattered thinly along the line, except where the comet had flown through. The rocks here were much smaller but more densely packed. However, they were still far, far from safe. Jets of gas from the comet were now shooting out everywhere. Soon one could erupt right underneath them. It was now so hazy from all the explosions that they could hardly see the sky. Just the sun and a faint little blue dot that was slowly getting bigger. George turned to Annie and pointed at the blue dot ahead. She nodded and tried to spell out a word with the finger of her space glove in the air. George could only make out the first letter, E. As they got closer to it, the comet tilted slightly toward it, and George suddenly realized that what Annie was trying to tell him. E was for Earth. The tiny blue dot in front of him was the planet Earth. It was so small compared to the other planets and so beautiful, and it was his planet and his home. He desperately wanted to be back there now, this very second. He wrote Cosmos in the air with his space glove, but Annie just shook her head and wrote the word no with her finger. Around them, the conditions were getting worse by the second. Hundreds and hundreds of fountains of gas and dust were erupting all over it. They huddled together, two castaways in space, with no idea how to get out of the awful trouble they had landed themselves in. At least, George thought, in a strange, dreamlike way, I've seen the Earth from space, and he wished he could have told everyone back home how tiny and fragile the Earth was compared to the other planets. But there was no way they could get back home now. The fog of dust and gas was now so thick that they had even lost sight of the Earth's blue color. How could Cosmos have let them down like this? George was just wondering if this was the last thought he'd ever have when suddenly a doorway filled with light appeared on the ground next to them. Through it came a man in a spacesuit who unhooked them both from the comet and, one at a time, picked them up and threw them through the door. A split second later, Annie and then George landed with a bump on the floor of Eric's library. The man who had grabbed them quickly followed, and the doorway slammed shut behind him. Pulling off his space helmet and glaring down at George and Annie, who were sprawled on the library floor in their spacesuits, Eric shouted, "What on earth did you think you were doing?" Go check out the Google Docs for some questions.